Her face was hollowed, and her large brown eyes looked weary, holding a depth far beyond what any 3-year-old should carry. She lifted her gaze toward the tall stranger standing in the doorway, cautious and unsure. Gordy lowered himself to one knee a short distance away so he wouldn't seem threatening. From the inside pocket of his coat, he took out a photograph he had kept carefully folded for months. He placed it gently on the small table before her and slowly pushed it closer. The picture showed Tara shortly before her disappearance, a bright-eyed little girl with a mischievous smile, long shiny blonde hair cascading past her shoulders, dressed in a Christmas sweater. As the child's eyes settled on the image, a flicker of recognition passed over her face. Gordy spoke quietly, emotion tightening his voice. "Sweetheart, do you know who this is?" For several long seconds, she only stared. The room remained still. One of the nurses froze, barely breathing. Gordy could hear the pounding of his own heart. At last, the girl slowly lifted her hand and touched the photo with a single finger. "That's me," the little girl whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Then, even more quietly, almost breaking, she added, "I want my long hair back." Gordy swallowed hard, fighting the sudden ache in his throat. Those were the first words she had spoken, and they erased any remaining doubt. This was Tara. She not only knew who she was, but remembered her long hair, a part of herself her captors had tried to take away. Tears blurred Gordy's vision as he reached out, gently covering her hand with his own. "We'll get your long hair back," he promised softly. Very gently. In the dense, narrow space of the family van on a Saturday afternoon, February 6, 1982, 9-year-old Jeremy Burke and his sister, Tara Elizabeth Burke, waited with the restless patience of children. Tara, a toddler of just 2 years and 9 months born on May 17, 1979, clung to the quiet innocence of her early years, still in diapers and far from understanding the complexities of the world outside the glass. Her father, Stephen Burke, a blind piano tuner with an acute sense of sound, and her mother, Elizabeth, had stepped into an auto parts store in Concord, California. It was a mundane errand, a brief pause intended to last only minutes before the family continued their weekend plans. But in the predatory world of child abduction, those minutes were a fatal window. As the bell of the shop signaled her parents' entry, a figure approached the vehicle. He was a young man, capped with a dark blue corduroy visor that shadowed his features. He tapped on the glass, his eyes scanning the two vulnerable children. With a calm, practiced deception, he uttered the words that would haunt the Burke family for decades. "Your parents want Tara to come inside and help with something." Jeremy, driven by a big brother's instinct to be helpful, did not hesitate. The moment the door lock clicked open, the sanctuary of the family van was breached, and the trajectory of their lives was irrevocably altered. The stranger did not waste a heartbeat. He snatched Tara from the seat, slung her over his shoulder like a sack of grain, and bolted across the parking lot toward a nearby apartment complex. Tara, too young to grasp the gravity of the moment, vanished into the gathering shadows. Jeremy's voice soon tore through the store's interior. Someone took Tara. The cry reached Stephen Burke first. Though he could not see the vacancy in the van, he felt the immediate chilling vacuum of his daughter's absence. He and Elizabeth surged into the parking lot, but they were met only with the receding roar of a getaway car. Left behind on the asphalt was a single clue, a dark blue corduroy cap blown off in the suspect's haste. At that moment, no one knew the names of the shadows that had descended upon them. The youth who grabbed her was 17-year-old Alex Cabarga, acting under the iron-fisted influence of the man waiting behind the wheel 33-year-old Luis Tree Frog Johnson, born in 1948. These two names would soon become synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in California's criminal history. There were no ransom notes, no phone calls, and no immediate trails. For Stephen and Elizabeth Burke, standing in that Concord parking lot, a 10-month descent into a living hell had just begun. The silence that followed the screech of tires in that Concord parking lot on February 6, 1982, was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating void that seemed to swallow the very air around Stephen and Elizabeth Burke, while the dark blue corduroy cap lay abandoned on the pavement. A silent witness to the vanishing of 3-year-old Tara Elizabeth Burke, the machinery of law enforcement began to grind into motion with a frantic, desperate energy. Within hours, the Concord Police Department, alongside specialized agents from the FBI, transformed the serene suburban landscape into a high-stakes command center. At the heart of this gathering storm stood Sergeant Dick Gordy, a veteran investigator whose life, though he did not know it yet, would become inextricably linked to the curly-haired girl in the photograph for the next several decades. The investigators were working against a clock that felt like it was moving in slow motion, yet every second felt like a betrayal. They had a name that would soon be etched into the local consciousness: Tara Elizabeth Burke, born May 17, 1979, and a hauntingly sparse set of clues that offered more questions than answers. Jeremy's description of the youth with the dark, curly hair and the blue jacket featuring a snake-like emblem became the fragile North Star for the search. This emblem, later identified as strikingly similar to the Alfa Romeo logo, was a needle in a haystack of Northern California's sprawling industrial zones and maze-like apartment complexes. Over the next several months, the task force would chase down over 1,500 individual leads, each one initially glowing with the fire of hope before flickering out into another frustrating dead end. Every green or blue Plymouth satellite in the Tri-County area was stopped and searched. Every young male fitting the physical profile of the 17-year-old Alex Cabarga was scrutinized under the harsh glare of interrogation lights. Yet, the true architect of this nightmare, 33-year-old Louise Treefrog Johnson, born in 1948, remained a ghost, a shadow lurking just beyond the reach of the law. For Stephen Burke, the agony of the search was amplified by the literal darkness he lived in every day. As a blind piano tuner, his world relied on the precision of vibrations, the clarity of notes, and the subtle nuances of sound. But now, his internal world was a discordant, jarring symphony of what-ifs and where is she? He spent hours standing in the driveway of their West Pittsburgh home, his ears strained to catch the high-pitched melodic laugh that usually filled the air, his hands tracing the empty, cold space where his daughter used to play. Elizabeth, a manager at a local pet store, found herself paralyzed by the telephone, waiting for a ransom call that never rang, a demand that never came. There was no request for money, no political agenda, and no sign of life, just a terrifying, unexplained absence that felt like a slow-acting poison. The family, drowning in a sea of grief and desperation, eventually turned to every possible avenue: psychics, prayer circles, and national media pleas, all while grasping at any thread that might lead them back to the toddler who had simply wanted chicken nuggets before she was stolen from the safety of their car. As the weeks bled into months, the investigation hit a wall of institutional silence. The public's initial fervor began to drift toward other headlines, but inside the Concord police station, the flame did not die. Dick Gordy kept Tara's picture, the one with her brown eyes wide and full of light pinned to his sun visor, a constant, silent reminder of the failure to bring her home. What the police did not know, and what the public could not yet conceive in their darkest nightmares, was that Tara was not hundreds of miles away in another state. She was hiding in plain sight, confined within the claustrophobic corrugated metal walls of a mobile prison, a delivery van. She was moving through the very streets that the search parties were patrolling, passing by the same warehouses and diners where detectives ate their lunch. The shadow of the van was lengthening, and inside that rolling cell, the innocence of a child born in the spring of 1979 was being systematically dismantled by the depraved whims of Louise Johnson and the compliance of Alex Cabarga. The psychological toll on the investigators was immense. For Dick Gordy, the case became personal. He began to feel a sense of responsibility that transcended his badge. He wasn't just looking for a missing child. He was looking for a daughter who belonged to his community. Every lead that went nowhere felt like a personal failure. He spent nights reviewing files, re-interviewing witnesses, and staring at the dark blue cap, hoping it would whisper a secret. The pressure from the community and the media was relentless. Every local news broadcast began with an update on the Burke case, and every time the answer was the same, no new leads. Meanwhile, the Burke family's life was falling apart. The stress of the disappearance was creating fractures in Stephen and Elizabeth's marriage. The once happy home was now filled with a heavy, unspoken grief. Jeremy, too, was struggling, carrying the weight of guilt for opening that van door. He felt like he had let his sister down, and no amount of reassurance from his parents could ease that burden. The community of Concord, once a place of safety and trust, was now a place of suspicion. Neighbors looked at each other with wary eyes, and parents held their children a little tighter. As the search passed the milestone of futility, the world was no closer to hearing Tara's voice again. The investigation had evolved from a sprint into a grueling marathon of endurance, a haunting test of whether a community's memory could outlast the calculated cruelty of two men who had vanished into the gray fog of the San Francisco Bay. The files grew thicker, the posters grew faded, but the resolve of those like Dick Gordy remained unshaken. They knew that somewhere, out there in the sprawling urban maze, Tara Elizabeth Burke was waiting to be found. And they would not stop until they brought her home, no matter how long it took or how deep the shadows became. The long, agonizing wait continued, a testament to the enduring power of hope in the face of unimaginable darkness. While the world outside continued to search for a ghost, the reality inside the mobile prison was a descent into a calculated, mechanical hell. For Tara Elizabeth Burke, born May 17, 1979, the vibrant colors of her early childhood were abruptly replaced by the gray, rusted interior of a 1969 delivery van. To understand the horror Tara endured, one must dissect the twisted dynamic between the two men who held her captive. The youth who had snatched her, 17-year-old Alex Cabarga, was not just an accomplice but a product of the very man who steered the vehicle. 33-year-old Louise Tree Frog Johnson, born in 1948. Johnson was a predator who had adopted Cabarga when the boy was only 9 years old, grooming and brutalizing him for nearly a decade. By 1982, Cabarga had become both a victim and a tool, an extension of Johnson's depravity, executing the abductions that Johnson orchestrated from the driver's seat. This was a cycle of abuse that expanded its diameter on that fateful February afternoon, pulling a toddler into a vortex of trauma that would last 10 agonizing months. The van was a claustrophobic chamber of horrors that moved restlessly across the industrial fringes of San Francisco and the desolate docks of China Basin. It was a rolling fortress, its corrugated metal walls insulating the screams of a child from the ears of a city that was actively looking for her. To prevent the 3-year-old from being recognized, Johnson and Cabarga enacted a systematic erasure of her identity that bordered on the ritualistic. Her golden blonde hair, which her mother Elizabeth so cherished, was hacked off with jagged shears and dyed a muddy, dark brown. They stripped her of her clothing, forcing her to remain naked for long stretches of time, not merely as an act of degradation, but as a tactical measure to discourage any attempt to bolt if a door were momentarily opened. More chillingly, they began a process of psychological re-engineering designed to sever her connection to the Burke family. They told the toddler she was no longer a girl named Tara. They told her she was a boy. They used hunger as a primary weapon of control, withholding food until she complied with their demands or participated in the filming of horrific pornographic materials that Johnson intended to distribute through a dark network of child predators. In April 1982, 2 months into Tara's captivity, the van's occupants grew by one. Mac Lin, an 11-year-old Vietnamese-American boy, was lured into the vehicle with a false promise. Johnson offered him $200 a month to act as a babysitter for the little girl. The reality was a bait-and-switch of the most sadistic kind. Mac quickly found himself a fellow prisoner, subjected to the same brutal regime of sexual abuse and physical violence. Johnson, whose nickname Tree Frog belied a monstrous nature, would frequently beat the children with a heavy rubber hose if they cried, moved too loudly, or showed any sign of resistance. Yet, amidst the stench of stale food, the chemical smell of hair dye, and the oppressive darkness of the cargo hold, a fragile, silent bond formed between the two children. Mac became the only source of humanity Tara had left, a protector who whispered to her in the dark while Johnson and Kabarga slept in the front cabin. He watched as Tara's spirit began to wither under the weight of Johnson's lessons, and he realized that if they were to survive, he would have to be more than just a witness. Johnson's endgame for Tara was as delusional as it was terrifying. He spoke openly to Kabarga about raising her to be his future wife, a child bride who would bear his children within the confines of their mobile fortress. He moved the van from one industrial lot to another, often parking near noisy construction sites or under the shadows of freeway overpasses to drown out any screams. The sheer proximity of their prison to the everyday life of San Francisco was a testament to Johnson's arrogance and the invisibility of those on the margins. They were often parked just blocks away from busy diners where workers drank their morning coffee, or near police precincts where detectives were filing reports on missing persons. Inside, Tara's memories of the blind piano tuner who loved her and the mother who is currently pleading for her life on national television began to fade, replaced by the constant, agonizing sting of the rubber hose and the flickering light of the Polaroid cameras that documented her stolen childhood. The conditions inside the van were unsanitary and inhumane. The children were often forced to use a bucket for a toilet, and the air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and fear. Johnson and Kabarga would occasionally buy cheap fast food, using the promise of a hamburger or fries to coerce the children into performing for the camera. For Tara, the world had shrunk to the size of a few square feet of metal floor. She began to respond only to the names they gave her vocabulary shrinking to the basic commands of her captors. The Tree Frog believed he had broken them both, that the walls of the van were now as much a part of their psychology as they were their physical reality. He saw himself as a patriarch of a twisted new family, oblivious to the fact that his son, Alex Kabarga, was a man-child trapped in a cycle he couldn't escape, and his children were victims of a crime that the state of California was not yet equipped to handle. As the months dragged toward the winter of 1982, the psychological toll on Mac Lin began to shift from paralyzed terror to a desperate, cold resolve. He was 11 years old, but the trauma had aged him by decades. He watched as Tara's spirit began to flicker out like a candle in a drafty room. He saw her beginning to accept the lie that she was a boy, her tiny hands often reaching out for him in the middle of the night for a comfort he could barely provide. But beneath the surface of his outward compliance, Mac was watching the roof. He was studying the vent, a small, rectangular opening that provided the only hint of the world outside. He measured the space with his eyes, calculated the strength of the latch, and waited for the one moment of negligence that would either lead to their deaths or their salvation. The stage was being set for a miracle that would eventually stun the nation, but in the fall of 1982, as the van hummed through the foggy and different streets of the Bay Area, it remained a rolling coffin for the innocence of Tara Elizabeth Burke. The investigation was 10 months old and cold, but inside the van, the heat of survival was just beginning to simmer. The arrival of winter in 1982 brought a biting chill to the San Francisco Bay, but for the searchers in Concord, the cold was felt most sharply in the silence of a case that had frozen in place. Sergeant Dick Gordy still carried the photograph of Tara Elizabeth Burke, born May 17, 1979, pressed against his heart in his tunic pocket, but even he could not have imagined that the miracle he prayed for was currently shivering behind a thin sheet of metal in the China Basin Industrial District. Inside the 1969 delivery van, the air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the metallic tang of fear. Louise Tree Frog Johnson, now 34, and his 18-year-old accomplice Alex Cabarga believed they had achieved total control over their captive family. They had spent 10 months stripping away the identity of a 3-year-old girl, but they had underestimated the silent, simmering resolve of the boy they had snatched to be her guardian. Mac Lin, the 11-year-old Vietnamese-American boy who had been trapped alongside Tara since April, had become the vessel for a bravery that transcended his years. He had endured the rubber hose, the sexual degradation, and the psychological torment of Johnson, but his focus had never strayed from the toddler who called him brother in the dark. Mac watched as Johnson grew increasingly complacent, emboldened by 10 months of evading the FBI and the Concord police. On the morning of December 18, 1982, that complacency created a sliver of opportunity. Johnson and Cabarga were distracted, perhaps lulled into a sense of security by the desolate surroundings of the San Francisco docks. Mac looked up at the roof of the van, at the small ventilation hatch he had been eyeing for weeks. It was a narrow, jagged opening, but for a boy who had lost everything, it was the only door to the world. With a heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, Macklin hoisted himself up. He moved with a desperate silence, his small frame slipping through the vent with agonizing slowness. Every scrape of his skin against the metal felt like a thunderclap in the quiet of the van. Once his feet touched the cold pavement of San Francisco, he didn't look back. He ran not just for himself, but for the girl whose hair had been dyed dark and whose name had been stolen. He reached a nearby acquaintance's home, gasping for air, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "The girl! The van! Call the police!" The call was placed to the San Francisco Police Department, and for the first time in 316 days, the shadow of the van was about to be pierced by the high beams of justice. When the police cruisers swarmed the industrial lot in China Basin, the scene they encountered was one of visceral horror. They found the van a nondescript, rusted vehicle that looked like 1,000 others in the city. When they pried open the doors, the stench of 10 months of captivity rushed out. Inside, huddled under a filthy blanket in the back, they found two figures. One was Alex Cabarga, naked from the waist down. Beside him was a small, trembling child. Her hair was short and dark, her skin pale from a lack of sunlight, and her eyes were wide with a terror that no 3-year-old should ever know. At first, the officers were confused. The child they were looking for was a blonde girl named Tara. The child before them had been told so many times that she was a boy that she no longer knew her own gender, let alone her own name. The initial identification was a chaotic blur of hope and hesitation. The San Francisco authorities contacted Dick Gordy in Concord. "We think we have her," they said, but they couldn't be sure. Gordy didn't wait. He drove toward San Francisco with the speed of a man possessed, carrying the fingerprint card he had secured from the Burke home months earlier. When he entered the room at the Child Protective Center, he saw a child who looked nothing like the girl in his pocket, yet everything like the soul he had been searching for. He knelt down, the weight of the 10-month marathon pressing on his shoulders, and pulled out the photograph of the smiling, blonde Tara. He held it up to the dark-haired child and asked the question that would end the longest year of his life. "Who is this?" The child looked at the picture. For a moment, the 10 months of Louise Johnson's brainwashing flickered against the bedrock of her true identity. A small, trembling hand reached out to touch the glossy surface of the photo. "That's me," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound that broke the silence of the room. "And I want my long hair back." In that single sentence, the erasure of Tara Elizabeth Burke was reversed. The fingerprint soon confirmed what Gordy's heart already knew. The daughter of the blind piano tuner had been found. As the news broke across California on that cold December evening, the state exhaled a collective breath it had been holding since February. But the rescue was only the beginning of a different kind of struggle. While Louise Johnson was hauled away in handcuffs, screaming obscenities, and Alex Cabarga was let out in a state of catatonic shock, the focus shifted to the damage left behind. Tara was physically alive, but she was a stranger to herself. She had spent nearly a third of her life in a rolling coffin, subjected to the whims of a tree frog and a youth who was himself a victim of a cycle of abuse. The physical walls of the van were gone, but the psychological walls were miles high. As the Burke family prepared for a reunion that they had once thought impossible, the reality of what it meant to come home began to settle in. Tara Elizabeth Burke was safe, but the girl who had disappeared in February 1982 was gone forever, replaced by a survivor who would have to learn how to live in the light again. The miracle of the rescue was complete, but the long shadow of the van would prove much harder to outrun. The jubilant headlines of late December 1982 soon gave way to the sterile, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the San Francisco Superior Court, where the miraculous rescue of Tara Elizabeth Burke was replaced by the grim, procedural accounting of her trauma. As the public celebrated her return, a complex legal and psychological battle was beginning to unfold, one that would challenge the California judicial system's understanding of victimhood and the true cost of survival. While the physical prison of the 1969 delivery van had been dismantled, the wreckage it left behind was sprawling, touching not only the 3-year-old girl born on May 17, 1979, but also the very foundations of the family that had spent 10 months praying for her return. The state now faced the daunting task of prosecuting 2 men whose crimes were so depraved they seemed to defy existing sentencing guidelines. The 34-year-old mastermind Louise Tree Frog Johnson and his 18-year-old protege Alex Cabarga. The trial of Louise Johnson, born in 1948, was a descent into a specific kind of darkness that few in the courtroom were prepared to witness. The evidence recovered from the van was overwhelming: a mountain of Polaroid photographs, rolls of film, and the infamous rubber hose used to enforce silence through pain. Johnson sat through the proceedings with a chilling detachment, a man whose nickname Tree Frog had transitioned from a quirk of the San Francisco underworld to a moniker of monstrous predation. He faced over 100 counts of kidnapping, child molestation, and the production of child pornography. The prosecution meticulously rebuilt the 10-month timeline, showing how Johnson had moved his mobile chamber of horrors through the industrial veins of the city while the Burke family withered in West Pittsburgh. When the verdict was finally read, the sentence reflected the sheer magnitude of his cruelty: 527 years in state prison. It was a symbolic and literal declaration that Louise Johnson would never again breathe the air of a free world, a sentence meant to bury him beneath the weight of his own depravity. However, the case of Alex Cabarga presented a far more agonizing moral and legal labyrinth. At 18, Cabarga stood at the intersection of perpetrator and victim. His defense team argued that his role in the abduction of Tara Elizabeth Burke was the inevitable result of a decade of systematic grooming and abuse at the hands of Johnson. Cabarga had been given to Johnson by his own parents at the age of 9, essentially becoming the first victim of the Van's legacy. For 9 years, he had been tortured, sexually assaulted, and psychologically broken until he became a tool for Johnson's expansion of his victim pool. The question before the court was whether a young man who had never known a life outside of abuse could be held fully responsible for the crimes he committed under the shadow of his own abuser. Initially, the court was unmoved by the nuance of his trauma, sentencing him to 208 years in prison. Yet, this decision would later be challenged by appellate judges who viewed the sentence as cruel and unusual, eventually leading to a reduction that recognized his dual status as a victim of Johnson's calculated evil. Behind the legal drama, the human cost was reaching a breaking point. For Stephen and Elizabeth Burke, the reunion they had dreamed of was not the fairy tale they had envisioned. Tara was physically home, but the toddler who had loved chicken nuggets in February 1982 was a stranger to the girl who returned in December. She suffered from severe night terrors and deep-seated fear of the dark and a confused sense of identity that made traditional childhood impossible. She believed she was a boy. She flinched at the sound of moving vehicles. She struggled to bond with the parents whose faces she had been forced to forget. The financial burden of her recovery was equally devastating. The family turned to the California Victim of Violent Crime Program for help, but they were met with a rigid institutional wall. At the time, the state's compensation was capped at a mere $10,000, a sum that was exhausted within a few short years of intensive psychiatric care. The situation took a turn toward the surreal and the infuriating when it was revealed that while Tara's funding was running dry, Alex Cabarga was successfully petitioning for state funds to cover his own psychiatric treatment while in prison. The irony was a jagged pill for the Burke family to swallow. The state was effectively prioritizing the rehabilitation of the kidnapper over the restoration of the child he had helped steal. This legal controversy sparked a national debate about the rights of victims and the limitations of social safety nets, but for Stephen Burke, the blind piano tuner, the debate was secondary to the silence growing in his own home. The strain of the abduction, the trial, and the agonizingly slow recovery process began to fracture the marriage that had survived the 10-month search. The what-ifs that had haunted them during the disappearance were replaced by the what-nows of a shattered reality. Eventually, the weight of the trauma became too much to bear, and Stephen and Elizabeth's marriage ended in divorce, making Tara Elizabeth Burke a victim of a second, quieter tragedy, the dissolution of the family unit she had finally been returned to. As the mid-1980s progressed, the case of Tara Burke became a case study in the long-term effects of childhood trauma and the failure of the justice system to provide holistic support for survivors. Tara herself began to withdraw, her sessions with therapists often ending in silence as she struggled to articulate the horrors of the van. She was a child caught between two worlds, the memory of a golden-haired girl from Concord and the dark-haired survivor from San Francisco. The community that had once rallied with posters and prayers began to move on, but for those directly involved, the case was a living, breathing entity. Sergeant Dick Gordy, the man who had never stopped looking, found himself unable to simply walk away after the handcuffs were clicked shut. He watched from the sidelines as the family he had helped reunite began to pull apart, and he realized that the closure promised by the legal system was an illusion. By the late 1980s, the story of Tara Elizabeth Burke had moved from the front pages to the archives, but the ripples of her 10 months in captivity continued to expand. The legal battles over Cabarga's sentencing and the funding for Tara's therapy highlighted a systemic unreadiness for the complexities of high-profile child abductions. It was a period of painful transition, where the innocence of the early 80s was being replaced by a more cynical, vigilant era of parenting. Inside the Burke household, or what was left of it, the struggle for a normal life continued in the shadows. Tara was growing older, her short, dyed hair growing out into its natural blonde, yet the scars on her psyche remained as jagged as the day she was found. The analysis of the case shifted from how did they find her to how does she survive this? This question would dominate the next decade of her life, leading toward an unexpected alliance and a transformation that would eventually see the survivor of the China Basin docks emerge as a symbol of resilience. But as the 1980s closed, the shadow of the van still loomed large, a dark reminder that some prisons do not require bars to keep their captives confined, and some debts of justice can never be fully repaid. As the 1990s dawned, the name Tara Elizabeth Burke, once a frantic headline in every Bay Area newspaper, began to transition from a cautionary tale into a profound study of human resilience. The dark, short-cropped hair that had defined her rescue had long since grown back into the natural golden blonde of her infancy, a physical reclamation of the identity Louise Johnson and Alex Cabarga had tried to bury in the China Basin docks. But for Tara, now entering her teenage years, the recovery was not a linear path. It was a daily negotiation with a past that refused to stay silent. The shadow of the van remained, yet it was during this period that a new, redemptive chapter began to write itself, one defined by an unlikely bond that would bridge the gap between the trauma of 1982 and the promise of a future. Sergeant Dick Gordy, the man who had kept Tara's photograph pinned to his visor for 10 long months, found that his role in her life did not end with the closing of the case file. While the legal system had delivered its 527-year sentence to Louise Tree Frog Johnson, born 1948, and a reduced, controversial term for the 17-year-old accomplice Alex Cabarga, Gordy recognized that Tara's true rescue was still ongoing. As her biological family struggled under the weight of divorce and the financial exhaustion of limited state aid, Gordy stepped into the breach, evolving from a cold case investigator into a surrogate father figure. He didn't just see a victim. He saw the potential of the girl born on May 17, 1979, to transcend the labels of abducted and abused. He became a steady anchor in her turbulent world, guiding her through the complexities of adolescence and encouraging her to see herself not as a broken child, but as a survivor with a voice. The dynamic of their relationship was built on a foundation of unique trust. Gordy had been there at the moment of her return, the one who held the fingerprint card that proved she existed when she herself was unsure. Throughout the late 80s and early 90s, he remained a constant presence. He was the one who understood why she flinched at the sound of a sliding van door or why she felt a compulsive need to keep the lights on during the night. He provided the emotional safety that the state-funded programs, with their caps and bureaucratic hurdles, could not. Gordy's commitment was not a professional obligation. It was a moral one. He had seen the absolute worst of humanity in that rusted delivery van in China Basin, and he was determined to ensure that the Tree Frog's legacy did not win the final battle for Tara's soul. By 1997, at 18 years old, Tara stood at a crossroads that would have seemed impossible during those dark nights of 1982, with Gordy's unwavering support including his efforts to raise funds through the police association and personal connections to cover her tuition. Tara enrolled at San Jose State University. This was the ultimate act of defiance against her captors. The girl who had once been forced to believe she was a boy, who had been stripped of her name and her dignity, was now walking across a sun-drenched campus as an independent woman. In interviews from this period, Tara began to use the symbol of the butterfly to describe her life, a creature that endures a cramped, dark existence in a cocoon before emerging with wings. The butterfly became her personal emblem, a stark contrast to the snake-like logo on the jacket of the man who had snatched her 15 years earlier. The legal echoes of the case, however, continued to ripple through the California courts. Alex Cabarga, having served 25 years of his sentence, was eventually paroled, a fact that reignited the debate over his dual status as a victim of Louise Johnson's grooming. For Tara, the news of his release was a chilling reminder of the fragility of safety, yet she refused to let it paralyze her. She spoke out at sentencing and parole hearings, her voice no longer the fragile whisper heard in the San Francisco Child Protection Center in 1982, but the clear, resonant tone of a woman who had reclaimed her narrative. She didn't seek vengeance. She sought the truth, testifying about the lingering effects of the kidnapping, the instinctual fear when a vehicle parked too close, or the psychological weight of a decade spent in recovery. Her courage in the courtroom provided a new template for how child survivors could confront their past without being consumed by it. Beyond her personal triumph, the case of Tara Elizabeth Burke served as a catalyst for systemic change. Her mother, Elizabeth, had fought tirelessly for the rights of victims, highlighting the absurdity of a system that would fund a kidnapper's therapy while cutting off the victims. Her advocacy, born from the pain of the Concord parking lot, helped push for legislative reforms in California that increased the support available for children who survived long-term abductions. The Tara Burke case became a reference point for lawmakers and child advocates, ensuring that the gaps in the safety net she fell through would be mended for future generations. Her tragedy, though deeply personal, became a public shield for others. Today, the legacy of Tara Elizabeth Burke stands as a cornerstone of modern criminal justice and victim advocacy. The relationship between the detective and the girl he found remains a testament to the fact that while evil is real, the commitment to good can be even more enduring. Dick Gordy, reflecting on his career, would later state that finding Tara was his greatest achievement not because of the arrest, but because of the person she became. He watched her transition from a terrified toddler in a filthy van to a woman pursuing her dreams, proving that the light of the human spirit can eventually pierce even the thickest sheet of corrugated metal. The story of the shadow in the van is a tragedy, yes, but it is also a documentary of survival. It serves as a reminder to every community that vigilance is necessary, but hope is mandatory. As the years distance us from that February afternoon in 1982 in Concord, the image of the blind piano tuner's daughter remains clear. She is no longer the girl in the missing person poster. She is the butterfly that survived the storm. The case of Tara Elizabeth Burke is closed in the police archives, but her life remains an open, vibrant testament to the fact that no matter how deep the darkness, the morning always finds a way back to those who refuse to let go of the light. The van is gone. Louise Johnson remains in his cell, and Tara Burke is finally and forever home.